Chapter 8. The Jews. Polygamy increases their population. During the 1st century AD, the Jews lost their temple, their city, their nation, and their priests. They had little alternative but to wander through the hostile world trying to preserve their lives. Returning to their holy city, Jerusalem, where 1 million of their people had been killed, was forbidden. In a rebellion called Bar Kokhba, 132 to 135 AD, the Jews tried to regain Judea and Palestine, where 985 towns had been wiped out and 580,000 men and women were slain. The Jewish population was reduced to half its former size. Under Roman rule, the Jews had an equal footing with other religions, but when Constantine favored the Christians, the Jews suffered heavy taxes and unfair restrictions. If a Christian and Jew got married, it meant the death penalty. The rabbis were banished in 337 AD, but in 352 they rebelled, and thousands were killed and thousands more enslaved. The emperor, Julian, was a savior to them in 361 AD by reducing taxes and restrictions and allowing them to return to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem even with state funds. But two serious difficulties arose as they began digging the foundation. 1. There was a burst of flames from the ground, probably natural gas, which discouraged many from that work, and 2. Julian died, and state funds were withdrawn. Old restrictions were again imposed with even more severity. Picture: destruction of the temple at Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD. Picture: Jews praying at Jerusalem's Wailing Wall, Western Wall, a remaining section of a high wall that surrounded Herod's temple. The Jewish population dwindled to 1/10 of its earlier number. They immigrated to other lands, mostly Mesopotamia and Persia, where they seemed to prosper at least in numbers. The Jewish communities in Persia multiplied rapidly, for Persian law permitted, and the Jews practiced polygamy, for reasons that we have seen under Mohammedan law. The story of civilization, Will Durand 4:348. The Jews encouraged polygamy because of their surplus women. Some Jews went to Arabia, where they could also live plural marriage and well in peace with their fellow Semites. That polygamy survived into the Christian era is, however, asserted by Josephus and Zvai 1 and 2, and he himself, Vita s. 75, seems to have had one wife in Palestine and another in Egypt. The Jewish law reached the Middle Ages with polygamy permitted, but not much practiced. So in his codification of the Jewish law, Maimonides makes it lawful for man to contract many simultaneous marriages. But this must not be taken to represent the personal opinion of Maimonides, especially if the letter attributed to him concerning the French rabbis be authentic. The law, as laid down in the Talmud and codified by Maimonides, required, however, that the husband should not only ensure to each wife adequate maintenance, each wife could claim a separate domicile, but should also secure for each full conjugal rights. It must be remembered that in the Jewish view the purpose of marriage was not to satisfy carnal desires, but to raise up a family, hence it was not uncommon that a man was permitted and even urged to take a second wife, when this purpose was unfulfilled. Occasional cases of bigamy are found in Spain as late as the 14th century. Jewish Enk, 8658. Justin Martyr is not wrong in asserting that in his time, 2nd century, Jews were permitted to have 4 or 5 wives. It was practiced among the rich and the nobility. Ibid. 10:120. It is written that the king should not multiply wives, Dut 17:17 as in the San. 21a, where the number is limited to 18, 24, or 48, according to the various interpretations given to 2 Sam. 12:8. Ibid. 10:121. Polygamy among the Jews was one of the main factors in their prolific numbers during the Dark Ages, but they usually followed the customs and laws of the various nations where they migrated. The position of a Jewish woman was legally low, but morally she was highly regarded. Plato, a Jew, said that he thanked God that he had not been born a woman, and the woman replied humbly, "I thank God that I was made according to his will." Woman in World History, E. M. White, page 176. The men were prone to take the law very seriously and tried to abide by its precepts. Some oaths were taken so seriously between Jews that his most solemn oath was taken by laying his hand upon the teeth of the man receiving the pledge, hence the word testimony. Story of Civilization, Durant, 4:381. Under the rules of the Talmud, early marriages were recommended, and usually a 14-year-old girl was ready, while it was about 18 for the man. The young men were encouraged to marry a girl not for her beauty, but for her qualifications as a good mother. The Talmud and the Quran, like the Old Testament, encouraged polygamy. "A man may marry as many wives as he pleases," said one rabbi, but another passage in the same tractate limited the number to 4, and a third required the husband, when taking a second wife, to give a divorce to the first wife, if she should ask for it. The institution of the levirate, by which a Jew was required to marry his brother's widow, presumed polygamy, and was probably due not only to kindly sentiment, but also to a desire for a high birth rate in a community which, like all ancient and medieval societies, suffered high mortality. Having allowed such freedom of mating for the man, the rabbis made adultery a capital crime. Ibid. 4:362. Polygamy was discouraged in the Christian nations and even some of the others, so it began to be a diminishing doctrine among the Jews. They began to write rules and regulations against it. Later enactments of the institution of the ketubah, which was introduced by the rabbis, still further discouraged polygamy, and subsequent enactments of the Geonim. See Muller's Maftia, Berlin, 1891, page 282. However, many Jews continued to accept plural marriages until around the year 1000 AD. At that time, Gershom ben Judah brought about a change in the doctrine. Polygamy was practiced by rich Jews in Islamic lands, but was rare among the Jews of Christendom. Post-Talmudic rabbinical literature refers 1,000 times to a man's wife, never to his wives. About the year 1000, Rabbi Gershom ben Judah of Mainz decreed the excommunication of any polygamous Jew, and soon thereafter, in all Europe except Spain, polygamy and concubinage became almost extinct among the Jews. Cases continued to occur, however, where a wife barren for 10 years after marriage allowed her husband to take a concubine or an additional wife. Parentage was vital. The same decree of Gershom abolished the old right of the husband to divorce his wife without her consent or guilt. Divorces were probably less frequent in medieval Jewry than in modern America. The Story of Civil. Durant, 4:380. Gershom ben Judah was called Gershom the Elder and was a French rabbi who was the founder of Talmudic studies in France and Germany. He was considered a profound and sagacious scholar, teaching and writing extensively. But his status and learning had little effect on his son, who became a Christian. Gershom was noted for such teachings as: A. It was necessary to obtain the consent of both parties in order to get a divorce. B. Modification of rules concerning those who became apostates under compulsion. C. Prohibition against opening correspondence addressed to another. D. But mostly for his prohibition of polygamy. It is written of him: An express prohibition against polygamy was pronounced by R. Gershom B. Judah, the Light of the Exile, 960-1028, which was soon accepted in all the communities of northern France and of Germany. The Jews of Spain and of Italy, as well as those of the Orient, continued to practice polygamy for a long period after that time, although the influence of the prohibition was felt even in those countries. Some authorities suggested that R. Gershom's decree was to be enforced for a time only, namely, up to 5000 AM. 1240 AD, probably believing that the Messiah would appear before that time, but this opinion was overruled by that of the majority of medieval Jewish rabbis. Jewish Enk, 10:121. Gershom ben Judah was to the Jews what Wilford Woodruff was to the Mormons. Both gave their advice and used their persuasion for their people to give up plural marriage, which was, in fact, heeded only by those who wanted to discontinue it anyway. Gershom did not persuade everyone against polygamy, and it continued among some of the Jews in various nations. People who believe in a particular religious order and then turn away from it are called apostates. The apostate then opposes the principles he once revered, is usually blinded by his opposition, often becomes like Judas, and is the worst antagonist of all. In his desperation to shake off and condemn his former beliefs, he makes false and vicious statements which soon become obvious to others. Such has happened to some Israelitish people, the Jews, and Mormons, who have turned against the doctrine of plural marriage. For instance, the authors of the Jewish Encyclopedia have shown their bias in the following statements. The prophets and the scribes looked upon it, plural marriage, with disfavor. At no time, however, was it practiced so much among the Israelites as among other nations. The ideal stature of human society, in the mind of the primitive Israelite, was a monogamous one. There is no biblical evidence that any of the prophets lived in polygamy. Polygamy was compared to polytheism or idolatrous worship. Jewish Enk, 10:120. The Jews, as with the early Christians, became influenced by the material world, its cultures, traditions, and pagan laws. The living of polygamy was usually attended with persecution and poverty on the one hand, while the world offered wealth and honor on the other. It didn't take long for them to choose the latter. There comes a time when the faithful adherents to principle become outnumbered by those who oppose them, then a strange transition occurs. The faithful are labeled apostates by the apostates. However, principles do not change, but men do. The Jews can't deny that polygamy existed in the Bible, nor will they say that it was never lived by some of their people. Yet today most of them do not recognize it as a necessary principle of their faith. But as in Mormonism, there are currently a limited number of Jews in Jerusalem, as well as in other countries, who still believe and practice plural marriage. Fortunately, eternal principles and laws of God find acceptance by a few.